He ran away from home at 17, with no money, no plan, and no future waiting for him anywhere. He lied to get published, hiding behind the voice of a woman who never existed, just so the world would finally listen to him. He would later risk his life flying a kite into a thunderstorm, chasing something invisible, something that could kill him in an instant, because he needed to know if it was true. And somehow, this same boy, with no formal education past the age of 10, no fortune, no family name that meant anything beyond a small candle shop in Boston, would grow into a man who negotiated with kings, outmaneuvered empires, and helped birth a nation that did not yet have a name for itself. How does someone like that happen? How does a boy who smells like tallow and wax, who spends his days dipping wicks in a hot fat in his father's shop, become one of the most quietly dangerous minds of his century? And what does a person have to give up? What do they have to bury inside themselves to become someone history cannot stop talking about? To understand it, we have to go back. Not to the famous moments, not to the lightning, not to the treaties, not to the old man in Paris charming a nation into funding a revolution. We have to go back to a small, crowded house in Boston in the early 1700s, where a boy is lying awake at night, listening to the sound of his own mind working faster than the world around him seems to want it to. Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706, the 15th of 17 children. 17. Think about that number for a moment. Think about what it means to be one voice among that many, in a house that was never quiet, never private, never entirely your own. His father, Josiah, was a soap and candle maker, a practical man, a man who believed in hard work and obedience and the fear of God, in roughly that order. His mother, Abia, gave him siblings he would spend his whole life writing letters to, long after most of them had become strangers connected only by blood and memory. There was no silence in that house. There was no room of his own. There was barely enough food, certainly not enough attention, and absolutely no expectation that this particular son, squeezed between so many others, would ever become anything more than another tradesman feeding another family in another small house on another crowded street. But something in him was already different, and it showed up first, quietly, in the way he read. Franklin loved books the way some children love secrets. He would spend whatever scraps of money came his way, not on sweets, not on toys, but on books, and he would read them at night, by candlelight he had likely made with his own hands earlier that day, the irony of it almost too perfect to be real. A boy who made candles for a living, reading by their flame, devouring everything from religious tracts to essays to early forms of journalism, trying to build, piece by piece, an education that no one was going to hand him. His father noticed this hunger and, for a brief moment, considered something extraordinary for a family like theirs. He thought about sending young Benjamin to be educated for the clergy. It would have meant grammar school, possibly even further study, a doorway into a different kind of life. But the doorway closed almost as quickly as it opened. The cost was too high. There were too many other children, too many other mouths, too many other needs pulling at the family's thin resources. After less than 2 years of formal schooling, it ended. Benjamin Franklin's official education stopped before he had even turned 11 years old. For most people, that would be the end of the story. A door closes, and you walk a different path, one already worn smooth by everyone else in your situation. You become what you're supposed to become. You stop dreaming past the walls of your father's shop. But Franklin didn't stop. He simply changed direction. If the world wasn't going to teach him, he would teach himself. And this decision, made so early, so quietly, with no one clapping for him, no one even noticing, would end up defining the entire shape of his life. Self-education would become not just something he did, but who he was. The architecture of his mind, built brick by his own hands, with no architect's blueprint to follow. His father put him to work in the candle shop, cutting wicks, melting tallow, running errands. And Franklin hated it. Not lazily, not in the way a child resents chores. He hated it in the way a person hates wearing shoes 2 sizes too small, every step a small, constant reminder that something doesn't fit. He had a mind that wanted to move, and the candle shop asked nothing of his mind at all. So his father, sensing the mismatch, began walking him around Boston, introducing him to different trades, trying to find something that would hold his attention. They visited joiners, bricklayers, turners, braziers. Franklin watched them all, polite, observant, and unmoved. None of it called to him, until they stood in front of his half-brother James's print shop. There was something about the printing press that caught him in a way none of the other trades had. Maybe it was the smell of ink. Maybe it was the rows of type. Each tiny letter a fragment of a sentence not yet written, a thought not yet shared. Maybe it was simply that, in a print shop, words were the product. And words were the one thing young Benjamin had always loved more than anything else in his short, crowded life. At 12 years old, he was apprenticed to his brother James. This should have been the beginning of stability. A trade, a future, a clear, respectable path laid out in front of him, the kind most boys his age would have been grateful for. And in some ways, it was exactly that. He learned the mechanics of printing quickly, the setting of type, the operation of the press, the rhythms of producing pamphlets and newspapers on a schedule that didn't wait for anyone's mood or excuse. But something else was happening beneath the surface, something more dangerous than ink-stained fingers. James was not a gentle master. He was demanding, often harsh, sometimes violent in the way masters of that era were simply allowed to be with their apprentices. Benjamin endured beatings, endured a kind of authority that expected obedience without explanation. And in a boy already wired to question, already addicted to reading and thinking and forming his own opinions, that kind of authority didn't crush him. It planted something instead, a small, simmering resentment toward power that demanded submission without ever having to justify itself. You can already see, if you look closely enough, the shape of the man who would one day stand in front of an empire and refuse to simply submit. But that was still years away. For now, he was just a teenager, sneaking books, secretly devouring essays on writing style late into the night, teaching himself to argue, to structure a sentence, to persuade a reader without ever raising his voice on the page. He would take essays he admired, break them down into notes, set the notes aside for days, and then try to rewrite the entire piece purely from memory, comparing his version against the original to see where his own writing fell short. Then he would do it again. And again. This wasn't homework. No one assigned this to him. This was a boy, alone, in the quiet hours when the rest of the household slept, training his own mind the way an athlete trains a body no one else believes will ever be strong. And it was working. His writing was improving in ways that, soon enough, even he couldn't keep to himself. There was a problem, though. James's newspaper, the New England Courant, was his brother's publication, written by adults, contributed to by adults, taken seriously because adults had written it. Benjamin was just the apprentice, the boy who set the type, not the boy who shaped the ideas. If he wanted to write something for the paper, if he wanted his own thoughts to appear in print, his brother would almost certainly say no. Or worse, he might say yes out of obligation, and then everyone reading it would already know to dismiss it, because everyone would know it was simply James's little brother playing at being a writer. So Benjamin did something that tells you almost everything you need to know about the kind of mind he had. He lied, not maliciously, not for personal gain in any selfish sense. He lied strategically, the way a person lies when they understand, even at 16 years old, that the truth itself isn't always what people respond to. Sometimes what people respond to is the voice they think is speaking. He invented a person, a widow. He named her Silence Dogood. Silence Dogood was witty, sharp-tongued, opinionated about Boston society, about marriage, about education, about the small hypocrisies of the world around her, and entirely fictional. Franklin wrote her letters late at night and slipped them, and signed, under the door of his brother's print shop, disguising his own handwriting so thoroughly that James had no idea who the mysterious correspondent actually was. And here is the part that must have felt to a 16-year-old boy hiding in the dark corners of his own family's business, like something close to magic. James loved the letters. He published them. Readers loved them too. People in Boston began speculating about who this clever widow actually was, debating her opinions in taverns and parlors, completely unaware that the voice provoking so much conversation belonged to a teenage boy who wasn't even allowed to put his own name on the page. Imagine sitting in that print shop, watching grown men argue about the ideas of a woman who exists nowhere except inside your own mind. Imagine the strange, electric thrill of being unseen and yet, for the first time in your life, truly heard. This is one of the most quietly important moments in Franklin's entire story, long before the lightning, long before the diplomacy, long before any of it. Because in that single act of deception, he discovered something that would shape the rest of his existence. He discovered the power of voice, of identity, of the mask a person can wear to say things the world isn't yet ready to hear from who they really are. But secrets, especially clever ones, rarely stay buried forever. Eventually, James discovered the truth. And whatever pride he might have felt at his little brother's talent was, by all accounts, overwhelmed by something else entirely, something closer to anger, maybe even humiliation. The brotherly relationship, already strained by years of harsh treatment and quiet resentment, cracked further. The beatings, the arguments, the suffocating feeling of being controlled by someone who refused to see him as anything more than a subordinate, all of it kept building. And then politics made everything worse. James ran into trouble with colonial authorities over something he published, and for a period, he was imprisoned, leaving young Benjamin technically in charge of the paper. For the first time, Benjamin tasted what it felt like to run something, to have his own decisions matter, to not be controlled minute by another person's temper. When James returned, that taste of independence didn't simply disappear. If anything, it made the apprenticeship feel even more unbearable. The contract that bound Benjamin to his brother had years left to run. Legally, he wasn't free. Morally, in his own mind, he had already started to leave. So he made a decision that, on paper, looks reckless almost to the point of madness. At 17 years old, with the legal bond of his apprenticeship still very much in force, with no money saved, no guaranteed work waiting anywhere else, no family connections beyond the very family he was fleeing, Benjamin Franklin ran away. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask permission. He sold some of his books for travel money, and he left Boston, quietly, almost like smoke slipping out from under a door. He boarded a boat, uncertain even of exactly where he was going to end up, only certain that staying meant staying small, staying controlled, staying someone he no longer wanted to be. Picture that for a moment. A teenage boy, alone, with everything he owns fitting into whatever he can carry, sailing away from the only city he has ever known, away from his entire family, away from the safety of any guaranteed future, toward nothing more solid than a feeling that something else, somewhere else, has to be possible. He eventually made his way south, first briefly to New York, where there was no real opportunity waiting for him, and then onward, by boat and on foot, exhausted, dirty, his money nearly gone, until he arrived in Philadelphia. And this is one of those moments that, if it appeared in a film, you might assume was exaggerated for dramatic effect, except it happened almost exactly the way it sounds. He walked into Philadelphia as a complete stranger, unwashed from travel, his pockets nearly empty, carrying a small amount of money and, famously, a few loaves of bread he had bought because he was starving and didn't yet know the city well enough to know what else to do. He looked, by every outward measure, like exactly what he was. A penniless runaway with absolutely nothing to his name. Years later, he would write about that walk through the unfamiliar streets, bread tucked under his arm, completely unaware that one of the women watching him from a doorway that day would later become his wife, completely unaware that this ridiculous, humble, slightly absurd entrance into the city would become one of the most quoted moments of his entire life story. But in that exact instant, none of that mattered. In that instant, he was simply a frightened, hungry teenager in a city that owed him nothing, with no family safety net behind him, no formal education to fall back on, and only one real asset to his name: his mind, and the discipline he had already, quietly, secretly, been building inside it for years. Philadelphia gave him something Boston never could: distance, anonymity, a blank page that he found work in print shops, impressing employers with skills far beyond what anyone expected from a ragged teenage arrival. His apprenticeship-trained hands moved with a competence that surprised people, and his mind, sharpened by all those secret nights of self-taught writing exercises, set him apart even further. He wasn't simply someone who could operate a printing press. He was someone who understood language, persuasion, structure, the subtle architecture, beneath a well-built argument. It didn't take long before people of influence began to notice him, including, eventually, the governor of Pennsylvania himself, who saw enough promise in this young printer to encourage an ambitious, almost dizzying plan. The governor suggested that Franklin travel to London to acquire equipment and connections to start his own printing business back in Philadelphia, even promising letters of introduction and financial backing to make it happen. So Franklin, still barely more than a teenager, crossed the ocean to London, full of expectation, believing real opportunity was waiting for him on the other side. It wasn't. The promised letters never arrived. The financial backing evaporated into nothing more than words that had cost the governor nothing to say and cost Franklin almost everything to believe. He found himself stranded in London, a foreign city, with barely any money, no powerful connections actually willing to help him, and the bitter, disorienting lesson that charm and promises from powerful men do not always translate into substance. It would have been easy, completely understandable, for a young man in that position to collapse into despair, or worse, to give up entirely on whatever ambitions had brought him so far from home in the first place. Instead, Franklin did what he always did. He adapted. He found work in London's print shops, immersing himself even deeper into the technical and intellectual world of the trade, surrounding himself with new ideas, new books, new debates happening in coffee houses and back rooms across the city. London, even in its cruelty toward him, became another kind of education, one more brutal, but in its own way, just as valuable as anything he could have learned in a formal classroom back in Boston. Eventually, after a year and a half of struggle, of learning, of surviving largely on his own resourcefulness, he made his way back to Philadelphia. And the young man who returned was not the same young man who had left. He returned with sharper skills, deeper experience, and a kind of hardened, quiet confidence that only comes from having been disappointed by the world and surviving it anyway. He went back into printing, and slowly, deliberately, methodically, he began building something that belonged entirely to him. He started his own printing business. He took over a struggling newspaper and transformed it, through wit, sharp writing, and an instinct for what readers actually wanted, into something genuinely successful. He understood, in a way many of his competitors didn't, that a newspaper wasn't just a collection of facts. It was a kind of voice, a personality, something readers wanted to return to again and again, the same way they once eagerly awaited the next letter from a clever, opinionated widow who never actually existed. And alongside the business itself, he was quietly, relentlessly continuing the project he had begun years earlier in the dark hours of his apprenticeship. The project of building himself. He created a now famous personal system, a list of virtues he wanted to master, things like discipline, frugality, industry, humility, and he tracked his own behavior against them with the same obsessive precision he once used to rewrite essays from memory. He understood something most people never fully grasp, something almost unsettling in its simplicity. That character isn't something you're simply born with and forced to accept. It's something you can build deliberately, the same way you build a business, or a piece of writing, or a printing press from raw, disconnected parts. He was, in essence, running an experiment on himself, year after year, refining not just his skills, but his very identity. By his 20s, Benjamin Franklin, the runaway, the boy with no formal education, the apprentice who had once hidden behind the voice of an invented widow just to be taken seriously, was becoming something else entirely. A respected printer, a sharp, increasingly influential voice in Philadelphia's growing public life. A man people were beginning to notice, not because of who his father was, not because of inherited wealth or status, but because of what he had built, piece by piece, inside his own mind, through sheer relentless self-discipline. But this was still only the beginning. Because the man people in Philadelphia were starting to respect as a clever printer and a disciplined tradesman had no idea yet just how far his curiosity was about to take him. He had no idea that the same restless, self-taught mind that once devoured books by candlelight would soon turn its attention toward lightning itself, toward the very fabric of nature that terrified and mystified the entire civilized world. He had no idea that the skills he was sharpening now, persuasion, patience, careful observation, the ability to wear different voices and adapt to entirely different rooms full of entirely different people, were about to be tested on a stage far larger than Philadelphia. A stage that would eventually include the courts of Europe the halls of revolution, and the delicate, dangerous, high-stakes negotiations that would determine whether a fragile new idea called America would survive its own birth or collapse before it ever truly began. For now, though, he was simply a young printer in a growing colonial city, quietly building his reputation, quietly building himself, with absolutely no way of knowing just how much more there still was to come. The young printer Philadelphia was beginning to respect did not see himself the way later generations would. He didn't walk through the streets thinking of himself as a man destined for greatness. He thought, most days, about ink supplies, about overdue payments from customers, about whether the next issue of his newspaper would sell. But underneath that ordinary daily grind, something else was quietly stirring, something that would soon turn an ambitious tradesman into one of the most original civic minds the colonies had ever produced. It started, almost invisibly, with a club. In 1727, Franklin gathered a small group of friends, tradesmen and thinkers like himself, men with sharp minds, but without the wealth or status to be taken seriously in the existing social order of Philadelphia. He called this group the Junto. It met on Friday evenings, and on the surface it might have looked like nothing more than a casual gathering, men drinking, talking, arguing about politics and philosophy and business. But Franklin had designed it with a deeper purpose, almost like a machine built for mutual self-improvement. Members were required to take turns presenting essays on morals, politics, or natural philosophy, and then the group would debate them, not for the sake of winning arguments, but for the sake of sharpening one another's thinking. There was a rule, deceptively simple, that forbade direct contradiction or flat assertion of opinion. Members had to express doubts and disagreements gently, through careful questioning rather than blunt confrontation. Think about what that small detail reveals about the man designing it. Franklin understood something most people still struggle with today, something almost counterintuitive, that the fastest way to change a mind is rarely to attack it directly. People don't surrender their beliefs under pressure. They quietly fortify them, but invite someone to question their own thinking, gently, patiently, and the walls come down from the inside. The Junto became the seedbed for nearly everything that followed. Ideas were tested there long before they ever touched the wider world. And it wasn't long before this informal experiment in mutual improvement began producing very real, very visible results across the city itself. One evening, the conversation turned to a problem that frustrated nearly everyone in the group. Books were expensive, painfully so, and difficult to access unless you happened to be wealthy enough to build a private collection. Franklin proposed something that, at the time, felt almost radical in its simplicity. What if members pooled their resources, contributed money together, and built a shared collection that all of them could access? It worked, and from that small experiment grew something far larger. In 1731, Franklin helped establish the Library Company of Philadelphia, one of the first subscription libraries in the American colonies, a place where ordinary tradesmen, men without inherited wealth or university degrees, could access the same books, the same ideas, the same intellectual tools that had once been reserved almost exclusively for the elite. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, because it tells you something essential about what made Franklin different from so many ambitious men before and after him. He did not simply want to rise above his circumstances. He wanted to dismantle, piece by piece, the very barriers that had once stood in his own way. The boy who had been denied formal education by his family's poverty grew into a man determined to make education less dependent on luck and birth for everyone else. This pattern would repeat itself again and again throughout his life in Philadelphia, almost like a quiet, recurring rhythm beneath the surface of everything he did. Identify a problem, gather the right minds, build a practical solution, move on to the next one. When fires repeatedly devastated parts of the city, destroying homes and businesses with terrifying speed, Franklin didn't simply write essays lamenting the danger. He organized one of the first volunteer firefighting companies in the colonies, the Union Fire Company, training ordinary citizens to respond quickly and effectively before disaster could spread out of control. When the city's streets were dark, dangerous, and difficult to navigate at night, he proposed improvements to street lighting, refining the design of lamps so they would burn more efficiently and require less frequent cleaning. A small technical adjustment that made an enormous difference in daily life for thousands of people who never knew his name. When the city needed better protection during wartime, he organized a colonial militia. When Philadelphia lacked a hospital capable of caring for the sick and the poor, he helped establish one of the first in the colonies. When the streets needed better paving, when the city needed a more organized police force, when education needed expanding beyond what existing institutions offered, his name, quietly, persistently, kept appearing near the center of the solution. None of this made him famous in the way lightning eventually would, but it built something just as important. It built trust. It built a reputation, slowly, brick by brick, the same patient way he had once built his own character through years of private self-discipline. People in Philadelphia began to see him not simply as a clever printer with a sharp pen, but as someone who actually got things done, someone whose ideas had a strange tendency to actually work. And running parallel to all of this civic energy was something far more personal, something that grounded him in a way none of his public achievements ever could. Years earlier, on that very first walk through the unfamiliar streets of Philadelphia, bread tucked awkwardly under his arm, a young woman named Deborah Reed had watched him pass by from a doorway, an amused witness to his ridiculous, exhausted arrival in the city. Their paths crossed properly not long after, and something between them began to grow, quietly, the way most real relationships do, without dramatic declarations, just steady familiarity deepening over time. But Franklin's journey to London interrupted things in a way that left lasting damage. Communication across the ocean in that era was unreliable at best, and during his prolonged absence, with no clear word from him for long stretches, Deborah eventually married someone else, a decision made out of practical necessity rather than romantic preference, in circumstances that quickly turned difficult and unstable. When Franklin returned to Philadelphia, he found Deborah in a complicated, painful situation, her marriage already faltering. The two of them eventually reunited, not through any formal church wedding, but through what was recognized at the time as a common-law marriage, a quiet, practical commitment built on genuine affection and mutual respect rather than romantic spectacle. Their household grew to include not only the children they had together, but also Franklin's son William, born before the marriage, whose mother's identity remains one of the genuine, unresolved mysteries of his personal life, a detail he never fully clarified, even in his own later writings. Deborah raised William alongside their own children with a steadiness that suggests whatever complicated emotions existed beneath the surface, a household that functioned, that held together, in a city built on uncertainty. Deborah herself was not the kind of woman history typically celebrates with grand portraits and dramatic stories. She managed their household, ran much of the practical side of their growing print business, handled money, customers, and logistics with a competence that freed her husband to pursue the increasingly ambitious civic and intellectual projects consuming more and more of his time and attention. In many ways, the empire of ideas Franklin was building above the surface rested on a foundation of steady, unglamorous labor she provided beneath it. Labor history has too often reduced to a footnote. It was within this stable, practical partnership that Franklin's most famous early literary creation was born, an idea that would make him wealthy and far more widely known than any newspaper or civic project ever could. In 1732, under yet another invented identity, this time a fictional astrologer and almanac maker named Richard Saunders, Franklin began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac. On the surface, it was simply what almanacs of the era typically were: weather predictions, astronomical information, practical farming advice. But Franklin filled the margins, the empty spaces between calendar dates, with something else entirely. Short, sharp, memorable bits of wisdom and wit, observations about money, about laziness, about human nature's endless capacity for self-deception, phrases designed to be quoted, repeated, passed from one mouth to another until they became woven into the very fabric of everyday colonial speech. Poor Richard's Almanac became an enormous success, published annually for 25 years, selling tens of thousands of copies, an almost unbelievable number for that era, reaching deep into households that owned almost no other books at all. Through Richard Saunders, Franklin built a relationship with ordinary readers across the colonies. shaping how an entire generation thought about thrift, diligence, and practical virtue, all while most of those readers had no idea the clever astrologer dispensing advice was, once again, an invented mask worn by the same printer from Philadelphia. There is something almost eerie when you step back and look at the full pattern of his life, about how often Franklin returned to this same trick. Silence Dogood as a teenager, hiding his real identity to be heard. Richard Saunders as an adult, hiding his real identity to be trusted. Again and again, he discovered that people respond differently to a voice than to a name, that sometimes the surest way to actually be believed is to disappear behind a character entirely. By his early 40s, Benjamin Franklin had achieved something that, by any reasonable measure, should have been more than enough for one lifetime. He had built a successful printing business. He had become wealthy enough, through Poor Richard's enormous popularity and a network of printing partnerships he had cleverly established in other colonies, to begin thinking seriously about retirement. He had helped transform Philadelphia's civic infrastructure through a relentless string of practical innovations. He had a stable family, a respected name, financial security that the runaway teenage apprentice of decades earlier could never have imagined. And in 1748, he did something almost no other ambitious, successful man of his era would have considered. He stepped back from the business itself, arranging a partnership that would continue generating income for him without requiring his daily involvement, deliberately freeing himself from the demands of commerce while he was still relatively young. Why would a man walk away from a thriving business at the height of its success? Because the same restless curiosity that once drove a teenage boy to teach himself writing in the dark hours of the night had never actually gone away. It had simply been waiting, patiently, beneath the surface of all that practical civic and commercial activity, for the moment it would finally be allowed to take center stage. Franklin had become increasingly fascinated by natural philosophy, by the strange, unexplained phenomena of the physical world, and there was one phenomenon in particular that had begun to consume his imagination almost completely: electricity. In the mid-1700s, electricity was barely understood by anyone, scientist or layperson alike. It existed mostly as a strange parlor curiosity, something demonstrated at public exhibitions where audiences gasped at small sparks generated by simple friction devices, an entertaining novelty with no clear practical use and no coherent scientific explanation behind it. Franklin, now with time on his hands for the first time in his adult life, threw himself into studying it with the same obsessive, methodical intensity he had once applied to rewriting essays from memory as a teenager. He began conducting his own experiments, carefully documenting results, developing theories about the nature of electrical charge that no one else had yet articulated with such clarity. He proposed, in correspondence that would eventually circulate throughout the scientific communities of Europe, the idea that electricity was not two separate fluids, as many natural philosophers of the time believed, but a single fluid that could exist in surplus or deficiency, what he termed positive and negative charge, terminology that, remarkably, is still used in physics today. He demonstrated, through careful experimentation, that electrical charge could be transferred between objects, that it followed observable, somewhat predictable patterns rather than behaving as pure, chaotic mystery. But there was one specific question gnawing at him more than any other. A question that, if answered, would connect his small laboratory experiments to one of the most terrifying, most ancient, least understood forces in all of nature. Was lightning itself simply electricity, on an unimaginably larger scale that it sounds almost obvious now, something every schoolchild learns as settled fact? But in the mid-1700s, this was a radical, almost heretical idea. Lightning had been understood for centuries as something closer to divine wrath, an inexplicable, uncontrollable expression of forces far beyond human comprehension or influence. To suggest that this same terrifying phenomenon was simply electricity, the same mild, sparking curiosity people generated in their parlors with simple devices, was to suggest that the heavens themselves operated according to rules a careful, patient mind might actually be able to understand. Franklin designed an experiment to test this theory, one that has become, perhaps more than any other single moment, the image most people associate with his entire life. In June of 1751, He and his son William flew a kite into a gathering thunderstorm, attaching a metal key to the string, waiting to see if the kite would draw electrical charge down from the clouds above. It is worth pausing here on just how genuinely dangerous this was. This was not a safe, controlled experiment in a modern laboratory with appropriate safeguards in place. This was a man and his son, standing in an open field as a storm gathered overhead, deliberately attempting to draw lightning's own electrical force down through a wet string toward their own hands. Other researchers who later attempted similar experiments would not be so fortunate. At least one European scientist attempting to replicate related electrical experiments involving storms was killed in the process. Franklin felt a spark jump from the key to his knuckle, a small, sharp shock confirming what he had theorized. The clouds above were charged with the very same electrical force he had been studying in miniature, controlled form inside his own home. Lightning was electricity. It is difficult, from where we stand now, centuries removed from that moment, to fully appreciate just how enormous this realization actually was. In a single, dangerous afternoon, a self-taught printer from Philadelphia had connected something previously considered an act of divine, incomprehensible power to a force that careful human observation and reasoning could actually begin to understand and, crucially, defend against. Because almost immediately, Franklin turned his discovery towards something intensely practical. If lightning was simply a powerful electrical discharge seeking the easiest path to the ground, then a properly designed metal rod, attached to a building and connected safely into the earth below, could intercept that discharge before it ever struck the structure itself, protecting homes, churches, and public buildings from the fires and destruction lightning strikes had caused for as long as human beings had been building things worth losing. The lightning rod, deceptively simple in its design, spread rapidly across both the American colonies and, soon after, across Europe, saving countless buildings and almost certainly countless lives from destruction. It remains, even now, fundamentally the same basic technology Franklin first proposed in the 1750s. News of his electrical experiments and theories spread quickly through scientific circles across the Atlantic. He was awarded honors and recognition from institutions in London, an almost unthinkable achievement for a man with no university education, no aristocratic background, no formal scientific training of any kind. The Royal Society, one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world, took serious notice of this colonial printer's work, eventually awarding him their highest honor and electing him as a member. Think about the distance traveled here. A boy whose formal education had ended before he turned 11. A boy whose own father had once seen him as little more than another set of hands for melting tallow into candles, was now being celebrated by the most respected scientific minds in Europe. His theories about electricity discussed and debated in the same rooms where the greatest natural philosophers of the age gathered to advance human understanding of the physical world. And yet, even at the height of this growing scientific fame, something else was quietly beginning to pull at Franklin's attention, something far less abstract than electricity, far more immediate and consequential than lightning rods and charged clouds. The relationship between the American colonies and the distant government that claimed authority over them was beginning to strain in ways that, at this point, most people on either side of the Atlantic still failed to recognize as the early tremors of something far larger. Disputes over taxation, governance, and representation were starting to surface, small disagreements that seemed, for now, manageable, resolvable. The ordinary friction of distant administration rather than anything approaching genuine crisis. Franklin, with his growing reputation, his proven ability to bridge different worlds, different audiences, different identities, was about to be pulled directly into the center of that friction. The same skills he had spent decades quietly developing, persuasion, patience, careful observation, the ability to wear different voices for different rooms, were about to be tested on a stage far larger and far more dangerous than Philadelphia's civic committees or Europe's scientific societies. He had no way of knowing yet just how completely this growing tension would consume the remainder of his life, how it would eventually send him back across the very ocean he had once crossed as a desperate, penniless young man chasing opportunity, this time as something else entirely. A negotiator, a diplomat, a man standing, almost alone, between two worlds that were beginning, slowly and then with terrifying speed, to pull apart from each other entirely. For years, Franklin had already been serving as a kind of bridge between Pennsylvania and the British government, first appointed as a colonial agent representing the interests of the Pennsylvania Assembly in London, a role that required him to live for extended periods on the other side of the Atlantic, navigating the corridors of power in a city that had once nearly broken him as a desperate, penniless teenager decades earlier. This time, he did not arrive hungry and friendless. He arrived as a respected man of science, a member of the Royal Society, someone whose name opened doors that would have remained firmly shut to the boy who once wandered London streets searching for work that never materialized. He moved among scientists, philosophers, politicians, and members of the aristocracy with an ease that masked just how unlikely his presence in those rooms actually was. For a long time, remarkably long when viewed through the lens of everything that would eventually happen, Franklin considered himself a loyal subject of the British Crown. He did not arrive in London as a revolutionary. He arrived as a problem solver, a pragmatist, a man who genuinely believed that the relationship between the American colonies and the mother country could be managed, adjusted, improved through careful negotiation and mutual understanding, the same way he had once solved Philadelphia's fire problems or its lighting problems. He believed, for years, that the empire was fundamentally sound, that its disputes with the colonies were the kind of friction that reasonable people on both sides could eventually smooth away. He even proposed, years before the deepest tensions erupted, a plan for uniting the American colonies more closely together, partly for mutual defense, partly for more efficient governance. The Albany Plan, as it became known, imagined a kind of federal structure binding the separate colonies into something more cohesive, an idea that, at the time, seemed almost unnecessary to most colonial leaders who saw little reason for such unity. The plan went nowhere. Few people in the 1750s could imagine why the colonies would ever need to act as one. It would take another 2 decades and a great deal of accumulated grievance before that same idea would suddenly seem not just reasonable, but absolutely essential. In the meantime, the empire's relationship with its American colonies began fraying in ways that grew increasingly difficult to dismiss as ordinary friction. The British government, deep in debt after years of costly warfare, looked toward the colonies as a source of revenue, imposing a series of taxes and regulations that, individually, might have seemed manageable, but collectively created a growing sense among colonists that their voices, their interests, their basic political rights were being treated as an afterthought by a government thousands of miles away that had never bothered to ask their opinion in the first place. The Stamp Act of 1765 became one of the clearest flashpoints, a direct tax imposed on virtually all printed materials in the colonies, from newspapers to legal documents to playing cards, requiring colonists to purchase specially stamped paper for nearly every transaction involving the written word. For a man like Franklin, a printer by trade, the irony was almost too sharp to ignore. A tax that struck directly at the printed word, the very tool he had used his entire life to build influence, persuade audiences, and shape public opinion. Colonial outrage over the Stamp Act was immediate and intense, and Franklin found himself summoned before the British Parliament to testify about colonial attitudes toward the tax, a moment that placed him directly at the center of one of the most consequential political confrontations of the era. Standing before members of Parliament, he answered question after question with the same careful, persuasive precision he had spent decades cultivating, explaining, patiently but firmly, that the colonies were willing to support Britain through traditional contributions, but viewed this particular tax as a fundamental violation of their right to govern their own internal affairs. His testimony was widely circulated and contributed meaningfully to the eventual repeal of the Stamp Act, a victory that, for a brief moment, suggested the relationship between colonies and crown might still be salvageable through exactly the kind of reasoned negotiation Franklin had always believed in. But repeal did not end the underlying tension. It merely delayed it. New taxes, new regulations, new assertions of parliamentary authority over colonial affairs kept emerging, each one reigniting the same fundamental argument about where the limits of distant governmental power actually lay, and who, ultimately, had the right to decide. Franklin remained in London for years, continuing to serve as an agent for Pennsylvania and eventually several other colonies as well, attempting again and again to bridge a gap that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming too wide to close. He wrote essays, met with officials, argued tirelessly for a version of the relationship between Britain and her colonies that preserved both the empire's unity and the colonies' fundamental rights. For years, he genuinely believed this balance was achievable. And then came an event that would mark a quiet, decisive turning point, both in the broader political crisis and in Franklin's own personal transformation from loyal subject to something else entirely. In 1772, Franklin came into possession of a set of private letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts. Letters that revealed Hutchinson privately advocating for harsher measures against colonial dissent than he had ever publicly admitted. Franklin sent these letters back to contacts in Massachusetts, intending, it seems, to expose what he viewed as a kind of quiet betrayal, a colonial governor secretly working against the very interests of the people he was supposed to represent. The letters were eventually published, causing immense political uproar both in the colonies and in London. And when the question arose of how exactly these private letters had made their way into public circulation, Franklin made a choice that revealed something important about his character, even at considerable personal cost. Rather than allow two other men, wrongly suspected of leaking the documents, to bear the consequences for something he himself had done, he publicly admitted his own role in obtaining and forwarding the letters. The British government's response was swift and humiliating. Franklin was summoned before the Privy Council, ostensibly regarding an unrelated petition from Massachusetts. But the session quickly transformed into something far more personal and punishing. For nearly an hour, in a crowded chamber filled with members of the political and aristocratic establishment who had once celebrated him as a brilliant man of science, Franklin stood largely silent while the Solicitor General delivered a blistering, deeply personal verbal attack against him, mocking his motives, his character, his loyalty, his very integrity, in front of an audience that, by several accounts, seemed to relish watching this self-made colonial intellectual being publicly torn apart. Franklin said almost nothing in his own defense throughout the entire ordeal. He simply stood there, absorbing it, his expression giving away little of whatever was happening beneath the surface. But something inside him shifted permanently in that room. The very next day, he was formally dismissed from his official position overseeing colonial postal services in America, a position he had held for years, stripped from him as a direct consequence of the humiliation he had just endured. It is difficult to overstate how significant this moment actually was, not in terms of headlines or immediate political consequence, but in terms of what it did to one man's internal sense of where he actually belonged. Franklin had spent years believing in the possibility of reconciliation, believing that reasonable men on both sides of the Atlantic could eventually find common ground. Standing in that chamber, watching powerful men he had once respected delight in dismantling him publicly, something in that belief quietly, permanently broke. He remained in London for a while longer, continuing diplomatic efforts almost out of habit. But the man who eventually boarded a ship back toward Philadelphia in early 1775 was not the same man who had crossed the ocean believing in empire. Word reached him, even as his ship made its way across the Atlantic, of armed conflict breaking out between colonial militia and British troops at Lexington and Concord. By the time Franklin's feet touched American soil again, the disagreement he had spent decades trying to negotiate had already, irreversibly, become something closer to war. There was personal heartbreak woven through this transformation as well, one that history often treats as a footnote, but which must have weighed heavily on Franklin in ways he rarely allowed himself to express publicly. His own son, William, the boy whose mother's identity Franklin had never fully revealed, had grown up to become the royal governor of New Jersey, deeply loyal to the very crown his father was now turning irrevocably against. As the revolution accelerated, father and son found themselves on opposite sides of an unbridgeable political divide, a rift that would never fully heal, even decades later, even after the war had long ended and history had clearly rendered its verdict on who had ultimately been correct. Imagine carrying that. Imagine standing at the center of a movement reshaping the future of an entire continent. knowing that the cost includes a permanent fracture with your own child, a relationship severed not by death, but by conviction, by two people who loved each other once and ended up, through forces larger than either of them, standing on opposite sides of history. Back in Philadelphia, now nearly 70 years old, an age at which most men of his era had long since retired from public life entirely, Franklin threw himself into the cause of American independence with an intensity that startled even those who already knew him well. He was elected to the Second Continental Congress. He served on committees managing the colony's postal system, their finances, their military preparations. And in the summer of 1776, he was appointed to a small committee tasked with drafting a formal declaration explaining and justifying the colony's break from Britain. The primary drafting fell mostly to a younger Virginia delegate named Thomas Jefferson, but Franklin, along with the other committee members, reviewed and revised the document, contributing edits that, while less famous than Jefferson's original language, still bear the careful, persuasive fingerprint of a man who had spent his entire life perfecting the art of saying exactly what needed to be said, no more, no less. There is a story, almost certainly true in its essential spirit, even if some details have been softened or sharpened over the years through retelling, about Franklin offering quiet reassurance to Jefferson as the document underwent revision and criticism from other members of Congress, encouraging the younger man not to take the editing process too personally, that public documents, by their very nature, belong to everyone who must eventually approve and defend them, not simply to the person who first put pen to paper. When the Declaration of Independence was finally adopted, Franklin reportedly offered a grim, characteristically dry observation to those around him about the gravity of what they had just done, something to the effect that they must now all hang together, because the alternative, should the revolution fail, would almost certainly mean hanging separately. It was treason, after all, in the eyes of the government they were defying. Every signature on that document was, quite literally, a potential death sentence, should the rebellion collapse. And the rebellion, in the summer of 1776, looked very much like it might collapse. The Continental Army was poorly equipped, poorly funded, facing the most powerful military force in the world. The new nation, if it could even be called that yet, had no navy capable of challenging British control of the seas, no established credit, no guarantee of recognition from any other government on earth. Independence had been declared. Survival was an entirely different, far less certain question. It was at this exact moment of maximum vulnerability that Congress turned, once again, to the same man who had spent decades building relationships, persuading skeptical audiences, navigating unfamiliar rooms full of powerful strangers. They needed someone capable of convincing a foreign power, one of the most significant and historically hostile rivals to Britain in all of Europe, to risk supporting an unproven, struggling rebellion with money, weapons, and eventually, if everything went well, military force. They needed someone to go to France. And in late 1776, at an age when most men of his era considered their working lives long finished, Benjamin Franklin once again boarded a ship and crossed the Atlantic, this time not as a frightened teenage runaway, not as a struggling young printer seeking opportunity, not even as a respected colonial agent negotiating policy disputes within the framework of an empire he still believed in. This time, he crossed the ocean as something entirely new, a representative of a nation that did not yet, in any meaningful sense, actually exist, a diplomat for a cause that could still, quite easily, end in failure, in arrests, in executions for treason against the crown he had once served. Everything that followed, the charm offensive he was about to unleash on French society, the secret negotiations, the alliance that would ultimately determine whether the American Revolution succeeded or collapsed into historical footnote, all of it rested on the shoulders of a nearly 70-year-old man who had spent his entire life learning, again and again, how to become exactly whoever a room most needed him to be. What waited for him in Paris would test every single skill he had spent decades quietly developing, and would transform Benjamin Franklin from a respected American statesman into something closer to a living legend, a figure so beloved by French society that his face would appear on rings, medallions, and snuff boxes throughout the country, even as the fate of an entire revolution hung, quite literally, on his ability to charm, persuade, and outmaneuver some of the most sophisticated political minds in Europe. Paris, in the winter of 1776, was nothing like London had been for him decades earlier. There was no hunger this time, no humiliation waiting around every corner. Instead, there was a strange, almost surreal kind of celebrity that began building around him almost the moment he stepped off the ship. French society had heard of Franklin long before he arrived on their shores. His reputation as the scientist who had tamed lightning itself, who had calmly walked into a thunderstorm and pulled its secrets down to earth with nothing more than a kite and a key, had already spread widely through Europe's intellectual circles. To the French, steeped in Enlightenment ideals about reason, nature, and human progress, Franklin was not simply a foreign diplomat representing a struggling rebellion. He was something closer to a living symbol, proof that natural philosophy and human reason could triumph over ignorance and fear, walking proof in the flesh. And Franklin, ever instinctive about audience and presentation, understood immediately what kind of character this particular room needed him to play. He abandoned the powdered wigs and formal court fashions typical of European diplomats. Instead, he appeared in simple clothing, often wearing a plain fur cap, presenting himself almost as a kind of rustic philosopher, a symbol of the supposedly natural, unspoiled virtue the French Enlightenment imagined existing somewhere out in the American wilderness, far from the corruption and artificiality of European aristocratic life. It was, in its own way, another mask, another invented identity, not so different from Silence Dogood or Richard Saunders decades earlier, except this time the character being performed was simply an exaggerated, carefully curated version of Franklin himself. It worked extraordinarily well. French high society became utterly captivated by him. His image appeared on rings, medallions, snuff boxes, and prints sold throughout Paris. Women of the French aristocracy competed for his attention at social gatherings. Voltaire himself, the most celebrated philosopher in all of Europe, met with Franklin in a meeting that thrilled onlookers, two of the most famous minds of the Enlightenment era standing face to face, a moment so symbolically charged that crowds gathered simply hoping to witness it. But underneath all the social spectacle, underneath the parties and the portraits and the genuine warmth French society seemed to feel toward this elderly American philosopher, an extraordinarily delicate and dangerous diplomatic game was unfolding, one where a single misstep could doom the entire American cause. France and Britain were long-standing rivals, having fought each other across multiple continents in previous decades, and French officials were certainly tempted by the strategic opportunity an American alliance presented, a chance to weaken their greatest geopolitical enemy by supporting a rebellion against British rule. But France was also a monarchy, deeply cautious about openly supporting a revolution built on ideas of self-government and resistance to royal authority, principles that, if examined too closely, posed uncomfortable questions about the legitimacy of monarchy itself. There was also the simple, brutal calculation of risk. Why would France commit money, weapons, and potentially its own military forces to support an uncertain rebellion that, as of the winter of 1776 and well into 1777, appeared to be losing? Franklin understood that persuasion alone would not be enough. France needed proof that the American cause was actually viable, that supporting it represented a genuine strategic opportunity rather than a reckless gamble on a doomed uprising. For nearly a year, Franklin worked patiently behind the scenes, engaging in careful diplomatic conversations, gathering intelligence, managing the delicate relationships between American interests and French officials who remained publicly cautious while privately weighing how far they might eventually be willing to go. And then, in late 1777, news arrived from America that changed everything. The Continental Army had achieved a major victory at Saratoga, forcing the surrender of an entire British army in upstate New York. It was the single most significant American military success of the war up to that point, undeniable proof that the rebellion was not simply a doomed uprising destined to be crushed within months. It suggested, for the first time with real credibility, that American forces might actually be capable of standing against the British military on their own terms. Franklin moved immediately. Using the momentum from Saratoga, he intensified negotiations with French officials, pressing the advantage created by this sudden shift in perceived American viability. The French government, watching their British rivals suffer such a significant blow, finally found the strategic confidence to commit openly to what they had been quietly considering for months. In February of 1778, France formally recognized American independence and signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the fledgling United States, agreements that Franklin himself had played an absolutely central role in negotiating. France committed not just financial support, which had already been flowing secretly for some time, but direct military assistance, including naval forces that would eventually prove decisive in the war's outcome. It is difficult to overstate just how consequential this moment actually was. Without French support, the American Revolution very likely fails. The Continental Army, chronically underfunded, undersupplied, and facing a vastly superior military and naval power, needed exactly this kind of external support to have any realistic chance of ultimate success. And the man most directly responsible for securing that support was the same self-taught printer who, decades earlier, had arrived in Philadelphia as a penniless teenage runaway with nothing but bread under his arm and a relentlessly self-educated mind. Franklin remained in France for years following the alliance, continuing to manage the increasingly complex diplomatic relationship between America and her new ally, securing loans, negotiating supply arrangements, and serving as the primary face of the American cause to European observers watching the unfolding conflict from across the continent. His role required constant vigilance, balancing competing interests, managing tensions between American representatives who sometimes disagreed sharply with one another, all while maintaining the delicate, carefully cultivated charm that kept French support flowing steadily toward a cause that, despite Saratoga, remained far from guaranteed victory. The war dragged on for years after the French alliance was secured, brutal and exhausting, testing the patience and resources of everyone involved. But slowly, gradually, the combined pressure of American resistance and French military support began to shift the balance decisively. In 1781, a combined American and French force trapped a major British army at Yorktown, Virginia, with French naval forces preventing British evacuation by sea while American and French ground troops closed in by land. The resulting surrender effectively ended major military operations in the war, though the formal diplomatic process of ending the conflict and establishing recognized peace would still take years to complete. And once again, it fell largely to Franklin, alongside fellow American diplomats John Adams and John Jay, to negotiate the formal peace settlement, a process that required navigating not just American and British interests, but the complicated, sometimes conflicting interests of France and Spain as well, allies whose own goals did not always perfectly align with what was best for the new United States. The negotiations were intricate, often tense, requiring exactly the kind of careful, patient persuasion Franklin had spent his entire life cultivating. There were moments of genuine disagreement even among the American negotiators themselves about how far they should go in pursuing terms favorable to the United States, even at the risk of straining relations with their French allies. But through it all, Franklin's steady, experienced presence helped guide the process toward a conclusion that secured remarkably favorable terms for the young nation, including recognition of independence, generous territorial boundaries extending to the Mississippi River, and fishing rights that would prove economically significant for generations. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally ended the Revolutionary War and confirmed what had once seemed almost impossible to imagine. The United States of America, a nation that had not even existed as a concept a decade earlier, was now formally recognized as independent by the very empire it had once been part of. Franklin remained in France for a brief period afterward, continuing to manage diplomatic affairs, before finally, in 1785, at nearly 80 years old, making the long journey back across the Atlantic to the country he had helped bring into existence. He returned to Philadelphia not as the struggling young printer who had once arrived with nothing, nor even as the respected civic leader and scientist of his middle years, but as something far rarer and more complicated. A living architect of an entirely new political experiment, beloved by many, watched closely by others, his health beginning to show the visible toll of a life lived with such relentless, restless intensity. he might reasonably have considered his life's work finished at this point. Few people would have begrudged a man approaching 80, having already secured independence, negotiated a war-ending peace treaty, and built an entire career of scientific and civic achievement before any of that, the right to simply rest. But the new nation he had helped create was, in 1787, facing a crisis of its own, one perhaps less dramatic than war, but no less consequential for whether the American experiment would actually survive. The loose confederation of states that had emerged from the Revolution was proving dangerously weak, unable to effectively manage trade, finances, or relations between the states themselves. Delegates began gathering in Philadelphia to consider not just amending the existing system, but potentially replacing it entirely with something stronger, more unified, more durable. Franklin, despite his advanced age and increasingly fragile health, was among the delegates who gathered for what would become known as the Constitutional Convention. He was, by this point, the oldest delegate present by a significant margin, often requiring assistance simply to attend sessions, his body increasingly betraying the limits that even his extraordinary mind could not entirely overcome. But age had not dulled his understanding of how rooms full of strongly opinionated, often deeply divided men actually worked. Throughout the long, contentious summer of debates, as delegates argued fiercely over representation, over the balance of power between large and small states, over the very structure of the government they were attempting to design from nothing, Franklin's role shifted from active architect to something closer to wise elder statesman, someone whose calm presence and occasional carefully chosen interventions helped ease tensions that threatened, at multiple points, to derail the entire convention. There is a moment, often retold, when the convention had reached a particularly difficult impasse over how states would be represented in the new government, larger states wanting representation based on population, smaller states fearing they would be permanently overwhelmed and ignored under such a system. Franklin, ever the patient negotiator, helped support what eventually became known as the Great Compromise, a structure dividing the legislature into two chambers, one based on population, the other granting equal representation to every state regardless of size, a solution that, while imperfect and the result of difficult negotiation rather than any single person's individual genius, helped hold the fragile convention together long enough to produce a finished document. When the Constitution was finally completed in September of 1787, Franklin, despite having reservations about certain aspects of the final document, urged his fellow delegates to support it nonetheless, offering a now famous reflection about the difficulty of ever expecting perfect agreement among so many different men with so many different interests, suggesting that even those with remaining doubts should consider setting them aside for the sake of the larger experiment they were all attempting together. As delegates filed out of Independence Hall after the convention concluded, a woman reportedly asked Franklin what kind of government they had created, a monarchy or a republic. His answer, brief and famously cautious, suggested it was a republic if the people could manage to keep it. That single phrase, weighted with both hope and warning, captures something essential about how Franklin understood the entire project he had spent the final decades of his life helping to build. Independence had been won. A constitution had been written, but none of it was guaranteed to last. The American experiment, in his understanding, was not a finished achievement to be admired from a safe distance, but an ongoing responsibility, fragile, dependent entirely on the continued effort and vigilance of the people living within it. He was, by this point, an old man in every sense that mattered, his body racked with painful conditions that had worsened steadily over his final years, his once tireless energy now spent in shorter, more careful increments. But even in this final stretch of his life, his restless mind refused to fully quiet itself. In his final years, Franklin turned his attention to a cause that revealed, perhaps more honestly than almost anything else in his long life, the complicated, sometimes contradictory nature of his own moral evolution. He became increasingly active in the movement against slavery, serving as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and signing a formal petition to Congress urging the new government to take meaningful steps toward ending the institution entirely. This stance did not emerge from a man who had always held clean, consistent views on the subject. Franklin himself had owned enslaved people earlier in his life, and his newspaper had, for years, carried advertisements related to the slave trade without apparent objection. His journey toward opposing slavery was neither early nor simple, and it arrived dramatically too late to influence the deep compromises already embedded into the Constitution he had just helped create. Compromises that allowed slavery to continue and even strengthened its protections within the new government's foundational structure. There is something genuinely difficult to sit with in this final chapter of his story, something that resists the comfortable, simple narrative of a brilliant self-made man whose journey only ever bent toward greater wisdom and virtue. The same man capable of such extraordinary foresight about electricity, about diplomacy, about civic institutions, had also spent the majority of his long life either directly participating in or quietly tolerating one of history's gravest moral failures, only turning firmly against it in the final years of his life, when his own influence, however genuine, could no longer meaningfully shape the document already shaping the nation's future. Perhaps this, more than any single triumph, reveals something essential about Benjamin Franklin's entire life. He was never a finished, perfect product of pure genius arriving fully formed. He was, from his very first night reading secretly by candlelight as a deprived younger son in a crowded Boston household, an unfinished project, constantly revising himself, sometimes brilliantly ahead of his era, sometimes painfully, stubbornly behind it, right up until the very end by the late 1780s. The man who had once flown a kite into a thunderstorm without flinching was now confined, for long stretches, to his bed, his body finally collecting the debts his restless mind had spent a lifetime ignoring. He suffered from painful kidney stones, gout, and a slow, grinding deterioration that made even simple movement an ordeal. And yet, even from that bed, surrounded by pain that would have silenced most men entirely, he kept writing. He worked, in these final years, on his autobiography, an account of his own life that he had begun decades earlier and returned to in fragments whenever circumstances allowed, never quite finishing it, the narrative trailing off before it could reach the very events that would make him most famous. There is something quietly fitting about that incompleteness, almost as if the story of Benjamin Franklin refused, even at the hands of the man who lived it, to be neatly closed and tied off. He could document the runaway apprentice, the secret writer hiding behind invented women and astrologers, the disciplined young printer building himself virtue by virtue. But the diplomat, the revolutionary, the framer of a nation's founding document, that man remained, in his own written account, mostly unwritten, left instead for history itself to finish telling. He also continued, almost compulsively, the habits that had defined him since childhood. He corresponded with friends and former colleagues across 2 continents. His letters filled with the same sharp wit, the same careful, persuasive clarity that had once convinced French aristocrats to bankroll a revolution and English parliamentarians to reconsider a tax. Even confined largely to one room, his mind never stopped reaching outward. In April of 1790, at 84 years old, Benjamin Franklin died in Philadelphia, the city that had once received him as a penniless, exhausted teenage runaway with nothing but a few loaves of bread under his arm. The same city now prepared to mourn him as something closer to a founding father of an entirely new kind of nation. His funeral, by the accounts of those who witnessed it, was staggering in scale. Tens of thousands of people, an extraordinary number for any American city of that era, filled the streets of Philadelphia to watch his procession pass. Members of Congress, civic leaders, ordinary tradesmen and laborers, clergy from multiple different faiths, all came together to walk behind the body of a man who had, across the span of a single remarkable lifetime, been a printer, a scientist, a civic reformer, a diplomat, and, in the final accounting, one of the architects of an entirely new political idea still very much in its fragile infancy. News of his death reached France not long afterward, and the response there was, in its own way, just as telling. The French National Assembly, in the midst of its own revolutionary upheaval, paused to officially mourn him, a remarkable gesture of respect for a foreign statesman, one that reflected just how deeply Franklin's presence in Paris years earlier had embedded itself into the broader story of Enlightenment era. political thought, not merely as an American figure, but as something closer to a shared symbol of reason and liberty stretching across both sides of the Atlantic. It is worth pausing, here at the very end of his life, to ask the question this entire story has quietly circled around from its very first moment. What did it actually cost Benjamin Franklin to become the man history remembers? Because it did cost him something. It cost him, for one, an enormous amount of ordinary human closeness. He spent years of his life physically separated from his wife Deborah, first during his early stay in London, and then again during his long diplomatic years in France, a separation so prolonged that Deborah died in 1774 while Franklin was still abroad, meaning the two of them, married for decades, were not even together at the moment of her death. He missed years of his children's lives, years of ordinary domestic existence that most people take for granted, sacrifice steadily, almost invisibly, to the larger civic and diplomatic projects consuming his attention. It cost him, even more painfully, his relationship with his own son. William Franklin, the boy whose mother Franklin never fully named, grew into a man whose deepest political convictions placed him permanently on the opposite side of his father's revolutionary cause. The two men never reconciled in any meaningful way. When the war ended, Franklin's will reportedly left William little beyond some property already in dispute, a final, almost wordless statement about a relationship that history's larger forces had broken beyond ordinary repair. Whatever private grief that fracture caused him, Franklin rarely allowed it to surface in his public writing, the same careful, controlled instinct that had always shaped which parts of himself he allowed the world to see. And it cost him, perhaps most subtly of all, a kind of constant internal labor that few people around him likely ever fully appreciated. From his very first nights secretly teaching himself to write better by rewriting essays from memory, to his careful, lifelong tracking of personal virtues, to his repeated decisions to hide behind invented identities, to his calculated self-presentation in the French court decades later, Franklin spent his entire life consciously constructing and reconstructing himself, refusing to simply accept whatever version of himself circumstance had initially handed him. That kind of relentless self-construction is, in its own way, a heavy thing to carry. It suggests a man who perhaps never entirely trusted that who he naturally was would be enough, who felt compelled, again and again, across every decade of his long life, to revise, improve, and strategically present himself anew for whatever room he found himself standing in next. And yet, set against all of that cost, stands an almost unbelievable scope of accomplishment. A runaway apprentice with no formal education beyond the age of 10 became one of the most celebrated scientific minds of his century, fundamentally reshaping human understanding of electricity and inventing a piece of technology, the lightning rod, that continues protecting buildings and lives to this very day. A printer's apprentice once beaten and controlled by his own brother became a civic reformer who helped build some of America's first libraries, hospitals, and volunteer fire departments, institutions whose descendants still serve their communities centuries later. A teenage boy who once hid behind the voice of an invented widow just to be heard became a diplomat capable of charming an entire foreign court into bankrolling a revolution that, without his particular blend of patience, wit, and strategic self-presentation, may very well have failed entirely. He helped draft the document declaring American independence. He helped negotiate the treaty that secured it. He helped write the Constitution that gave the resulting nation its enduring structure. Few individuals in human history can claim direct, substantial involvement in even one of those achievements. Franklin's fingerprints rest on all three. But perhaps the most enduring lesson sitting quietly beneath this entire sprawling story has nothing to do with lightning, or diplomacy, or revolution at all. Perhaps it lies instead in that earlier, smaller, far less famous image. A boy, deprived of formal schooling through no fault of his own, deciding, alone, in the dark hours of the night, that the absence of an education handed to him did not mean he was forbidden from building one himself. Everything else, the scientific breakthroughs, the civic institutions, the diplomatic triumphs, the founding documents, all of it grew outward from that single, quiet decision made by an unremarkable boy with no powerful family, no guaranteed future, and no reason, by any ordinary measure, to expect that his life would ever be remembered by anyone beyond his own immediate household. He once wrote, late in his life, a kind of guiding personal philosophy suggesting that most men die having never truly lived, simply existing through the years rather than genuinely inhabiting them, a reflection that reads almost like a final, quiet challenge directed not just at the era he belonged to, but at every era that would follow his own. Whatever else can be said about Benjamin Franklin, whatever contradictions and costs and unfinished moral reckonings exist within the full, honest account of his long life, no one could reasonably accuse him of failing to live. He filled his 84 years with an almost unimaginable density of action, curiosity, ambition, failure, reinvention, and consequence, stretching the ordinary boundaries of what a single human lifetime is generally assumed capable of containing. He arrived in Philadelphia as a nobody, dirty and exhausted, clutching bread he had bought because he was simply too hungry to think of anything else. He left the world as one of the most consequential figures in the history of an entire nation, a man whose face would eventually appear on currency, whose name would mark institutions, cities, and ideas across centuries he would never personally witness. And somewhere in between those 2 points, in the quiet, unglamorous, almost invisible labor of self-education, self-discipline, and relentless reinvention, lies the actual answer to the question this story began with. How does a runaway nobody become one of the most powerful and dangerous minds in history? Not through luck, not through inherited privilege, not even, despite how often the story gets told this way, through some singular flash of pure genius arriving fully formed and unearned. He became that man one deliberate decision at a time. One secret essay rewritten from memory in the dark. One invented voice borrowed just long enough to finally be heard. One dangerous kite flown into a storm because uncertainty felt more bearable than never knowing. One difficult ocean crossed, and then crossed again, and then crossed again after that, each time as a slightly different man than the one who had left. The cost was real. The doubts were real. The fractures in his closest relationships were real, and some of them never healed. But so, unmistakably, was everything he built. His face would eventually appear on the $100 bill. A strange kind of immortality for a man who spent decades of his life thinking carefully about money, about thrift, about the discipline required to build wealth slowly rather than chase it recklessly. Cities across America would carry his name. Universities, hospitals, civic institutions tracing their roots back to ideas he first proposed in a small room above a print shop, surrounded by a handful of tradesmen meeting on Friday evenings simply because one restless young printer believed ordinary people deserved access to the same tools of self-improvement once reserved for the wealthy. His sayings, the short, sharp observations he once slipped into the margins of an almanac under a fictional astrologer's name, are still quoted today by people who have never read a single word of his actual biography, who have no idea those phrases originated with a teenage runaway hiding behind invented identities just to be heard. They have simply become part of the language itself, absorbed so completely into common speech that their origin has nearly dissolved entirely. The ultimate, almost invisible victory for a man who always understood that ideas outlive the names attached to them. His scientific work laid groundwork that generations of physicists and engineers would build upon long after his death. The terminology he proposed for electrical charge still taught in classrooms centuries later, the lightning rod he designed still standing, in one form or another, on buildings across the entire world, quietly doing exactly what he intended it to do, protecting structures and the people inside them from a force that once seemed entirely beyond human understanding or control. And yet, for all of that enduring legacy, it is worth returning, one final time, to the image this entire story began with. Not the statesman, not the scientist, not the celebrated diplomat charming the French court with his carefully chosen fur cap and his quiet, deliberate humility. Just a boy, 17 years old, standing on the deck of a ship pulling slowly away from Boston Harbor, watching the only city he had ever known grow smaller and smaller behind him, with no money, no plan, and absolutely no guarantee that anything waiting ahead of him would be any better than what he was leaving behind. That boy had no way of knowing what his life would eventually become. He could not have imagined standing before the British Parliament, his testimony shaping the fate of an empire's tax policy. He could not have imagined a French court memorizing his face well enough to stamp it onto rings and snuff boxes sold throughout Paris. He could not have imagined a room full of delegates in Philadelphia turning to him, decades later, as the most respected voice present, asking him to help hold together the fragile compromise that would become a nation's founding government. All he knew, in that moment on the ship, was that staying meant becoming someone smaller than he believed himself capable of being. And so he left. Everything that followed, every scientific breakthrough, every civic institution, every diplomatic triumph, every painful personal cost along the way, grew outward from that single, frightened, uncertain decision made by a boy who had absolutely no business succeeding at anything, by any reasonable measure available to him at the time. It is tempting, looking back across the full sweep of his 84 years, to imagine Benjamin Franklin as something almost inevitable, a singular genius destined from birth to reshape the world around him. But that telling betrays the actual texture of how his life really unfolded. There was no inevitability here. There was only a relentless, sometimes lonely, often costly series of choices made again and again, across decades, by a man who simply refused to accept the limits the world kept trying to assign him. He was denied a formal education, so he built one for himself in the dark, one borrowed essay at a time. He was denied the freedom to speak in his own voice, so he invented other voices that the world would actually listen to. He was denied easy access to the rooms where power lived, so he spent a lifetime learning exactly how to walk into those rooms and leave them having quietly rearranged the furniture. That is, in the end, the real story beneath all the famous moments. Not lightning, not revolution, not even the founding of a nation, remarkable as that achievement remains. It is the story of an ordinary, deeply flawed human being, born into circumstances that offered him almost nothing, who decided, again and again, across every single decade of his long and complicated life, that the person he currently was did not have to be the final answer to the question of who he might still become. He ran. He lied. He risked everything more than once. He built and broke and rebuilt relationships that mattered to him. He carried contradictions he never fully resolved, moral failures he confronted far too late, costs he rarely spoke of openly even to those closest to him. And he became, through all of it, exactly the kind of man this story asked at its very beginning how anyone could possibly become. Not because the world handed it to him. Because, one impossible, deliberate choice at a time, he built it himself, long before any of the moments this story has already described. In the months Franklin spent working as a young printer's hand in London during his first, disastrous trip across the Atlantic, he filled his rare hours of leisure with the same restless curiosity that would define him for the rest of his life. He became, almost by accident, one of the most accomplished swimmers in the city, performing feats in the Thames that drew crowds of onlookers, at one point reportedly demonstrating swimming techniques to a gathering audience with such skill that he was later invited to consider opening a swimming school, an offer the young man declined, his ambitions already quietly pointed elsewhere. During that same difficult stretch in London, broke and largely friendless in a foreign city, he wrote and printed a small philosophical pamphlet questioning conventional religious notions of free will and moral responsibility, a youthful, somewhat audacious work of free thought that he later, in the more cautious reflection of middle age, came to regret and tried to suppress, buying back and destroying as many surviving copies as he could locate. It is a small, telling detail, easy to overlook amid the grander achievements that followed. Even the most disciplined, self-controlled architect of his own character had once been a brash young man capable of intellectual recklessness he would spend years quietly trying to walk back. He briefly experimented, around this same period of his life, with vegetarianism, partly out of genuine ethical curiosity about the treatment of animals, and partly, by his own later admission, out of simple economic necessity, since giving up meat freed up money that could instead be spent on books. It says something almost amusing about the man that even his early dietary experiments were quietly, practically calculated toward intellectual gain. Years later, back in Philadelphia, beyond the civic institutions and the famous kite experiment already woven into this story, his inventive mind kept producing small, practical solutions to ordinary problems most people simply learn to live with. Frustrated by drafty, inefficient fireplaces that wasted heat and filled rooms with smoke, he designed an improved iron stove, more efficient at warming a room, while using considerably less fuel, an invention that became widely adopted and still bears his name today. Troubled by the discomfort of constantly switching between two different pairs of glasses, one for distance and one for reading, he devised a way to combine both lenses into a single pair, creating what we now call bifocals, a small, deeply practical innovation born simply from his own aging eyes and his characteristic refusal to simply tolerate an inconvenience when a solution seemed possible. He even turned his curiosity toward music, encountering a set of tuned drinking glasses during his travels and refining the concept into an entirely new instrument, the glass harmonica, which produced an eerie, ethereal sound by spinning glass bowls and touching them with wet fingers. The instrument became genuinely popular across Europe for a time, with composers, including Mozart, writing pieces specifically for it, a strange and rather beautiful footnote to the life of a man more commonly remembered for lightning rods and revolutionary diplomacy. In Philadelphia, beyond the library and the fire company already part of this story, he helped establish the American Philosophical Society, an institution explicitly designed to promote useful knowledge across the colonies, gathering together scientists, inventors, and thinkers in a deliberate effort to ensure that American intellectual life would not remain permanently dependent on European institutions for its sense of legitimacy. He served for years as Deputy Postmaster General for the colonies, reforming and dramatically improving the speed and reliability of mail delivery across vast distances, a position that might sound mundane but was, in practical terms, one of the most important infrastructure achievements of his civic career, knitting together communication between colonies that had previously operated almost as isolated islands relative to one another. During the increasingly tense years before outright war, Franklin was even involved, alongside fellow delegate John Adams, in a final, largely doomed attempt at peace negotiation, meeting with a British representative, Lord Howe, on Staten Island in 1776, in a tense, carefully polite conversation that ultimately produced nothing. Both sides already too far apart in their fundamental positions for reconciliation to remain realistically possible. It is a quiet, often overlooked moment, a reminder that even as independence was being formally declared, certain rooms still held out hope, however briefly, that war might somehow still be avoided. And in France, the diplomatic mission that brought him such enormous personal fame was never as smooth or unified as the celebratory portraits and medallions might suggest. Franklin found himself in frequent, often bitter conflict with fellow American representatives, particularly John Adams, whose blunt, confrontational diplomatic style clashed sharply with Franklin's preference for patience, charm, and carefully cultivated personal relationships. Adams privately grew frustrated, even suspicious, of what he viewed as Franklin's excessive socializing, his late mornings, his apparent enjoyment of Parisian high society, failing, in Adams's view, to take the seriousness of their mission with appropriate gravity. History, looking back with the benefit of outcome, has generally judged Franklin's approach to have been the more effective one for that particular moment and that particular court, but the tension between these two founding figures, working uneasily side by side in a foreign capital with the fate of a revolution resting on their cooperation, was real and at times genuinely difficult. There were also quieter, more personal corners of his life in France rarely discussed in the grander telling of his diplomatic triumphs. He formed a close, affectionate friendship with Madame Helvetius, a widow of considerable wit and independence whose Parisian salon Franklin frequented regularly, the two of them engaging in playful, flirtatious correspondence that some historians have read as evidence of genuine romantic affection, even as Franklin, well into his 70s by this point, never remarried following Deborah's death years earlier. It is one more reminder that even amid treaties and revolutions, he remained, underneath everything, a man capable of warmth, humor, and ordinary human longing for companionship. As his diplomatic mission in France drew toward its conclusion, and as he prepared, finally, for the long voyage home, Franklin occupied some of his remaining time studying the Gulf Stream. the powerful ocean current running through the Atlantic, producing one of the earliest detailed charts attempting to map its path. Information that would meaningfully improve the speed and safety of transatlantic shipping routes for generations of sailors who would never know the elderly diplomat who had quietly mapped the waters beneath their ships. Even his sense of humor about his own eventual death reveals something of the man's particular character. As a young printer in his 20s, decades before any of these later achievements, he had written a playful epitaph for himself, imagining his own body as something like a worn-out book, its printing faded, its binding broken, lying now as food for worms, but expressing confidence that the work would not be entirely lost, that it would, in some new and more elegant edition, eventually appear once more, corrected and amended. It was a young man's joke about mortality, framed inevitably through the only craft he had ever truly known, the printing trade that first gave shape to his ambitions. He did not request this particular epitaph for his actual gravestone in the end, choosing instead, in his final years, a far simpler marker. But the early version survives in his papers, a small, almost playful window into how a teenage apprentice once imagined his own ending, decades before he could have possibly known just how extraordinary, complicated, and consequential that actual ending would eventually become. He is buried in Philadelphia, in the same city that once watched a hungry, friendless teenager wander its unfamiliar streets with bread tucked under his arm, having no idea that this exact spot of earth would one day become his final resting place. Visited for centuries afterward by strangers leaving small coins on his grave, a quiet, persistent tradition tied to his own old advice about the patient, steady value of saving even the smallest amounts, repeated by people who likely have no memory of where that habit of thought first came from, only that it feels, somehow, fitting to leave something small and steady behind for a man who built an entire life out of exactly that kind of patient accumulation. The ship that carried him home was slower than the ones that had carried him to France, or perhaps it only felt that way, because for the first time in nearly a decade he had nowhere urgent to be. He stood at the rail in the gray Atlantic light, an old man now, heavier in the body than he had been, his eyes troubled by the glare off the water, and he watched the horizon the way a man watches something he is not sure he will recognize when he finally reaches it. Philadelphia had changed in his absence. He had changed more. He had left America a printer who had become a philosopher, a colonial agent grown weary of being patient with kings. He returned a man who had helped bend the will of the most powerful court in Europe toward the survival of a nation that, when he departed, had barely existed outside the hopeful language of a declaration. He had walked the gardens of Versailles in a fur cap, had let the French believe what they wished to believe about the frontier sage, and had used their fascination as a kind of currency, spending it patiently, for years, until it bought guns, ships, loans, and finally, recognition. The peace was signed. The war was won. And now there was only the matter of what came next, which he understood, better than almost anyone stepping off that gangplank in 1785, was the harder and stranger problem. He came ashore at Philadelphia to crowds that seemed almost surprised by their own enthusiasm, bells ringing, militia firing salutes, his daughter Sally waiting at the dock with her children, some of whom he had never met. He was 79 years old. He had been away so long that the city's edges had grown unfamiliar to him. New buildings where there had been fields, new faces in the State House, a whole generation come of age never having known a king. But underneath the noise of the welcome, there was something quieter that he noticed immediately, something he had perhaps expected and dreaded in equal measure. This country he had just spent a decade convincing the world to take seriously did not yet know how to be a country at all. It was not a nation so much as an argument that 13 separate places had agreed, provisionally, not to have in public. There was no functioning currency to speak of, paper money worth less in some states than the paper it was printed on. There was no real power to tax, no power to compel, a Congress that could request but not require, an army that had nearly mutinied over unpaid wages even as the ink was drying on the peace treaty. Farmers in Massachusetts were taking up arms against the courts that meant to seize their land for unpaid debts, and men who had fought together at Trenton and Yorktown were beginning to ask each other, quietly, whether the whole experiment might simply come apart from the inside, the way overambitious things sometimes do. not from an enemy's blow, but from their own ungoverned weight. Franklin watched this unfold from his garden on Market Street, where he had returned to find his house finally finished, the library wing he had designed by letter from Paris now standing exactly as he'd imagined it, full of books and instruments, and the long mirror he'd had installed at an angle so he could see the street below without leaving his chair. He told friends he meant to retire there. He was not a young man's idea of an old man. He wanted, he said, to spend his remaining years among his books, his grandchildren, and his correspondence, free from the obligations that had occupied nearly the whole of his adult life. He had earned an ending. Almost everyone who knew him believed he deserved one. But Pennsylvania elected him president of its governing council within months of his return, an office he accepted with the particular weariness of a man who has learned that refusing public service rarely succeeds, and that it is sometimes easier to do a duty than to argue out of it. And then, in the spring of 1787, the invitation came that he could not in conscience decline. Delegates were to gather again in Philadelphia, this time not merely to patch the failing Articles of Confederation, but, as it would turn out, to attempt something far more audacious, to write, from nothing, the operating instructions for a republic that did not yet trust itself to survive its own freedom. He was the oldest man in the room by nearly 20 years. Washington, the presiding figure, was 55 and carried himself like a man who still expected to be obeyed. Madison was 36, his pockets full of notes, his mind already cataloging every argument for the historical record he alone seems to have understood they were creating. Hamilton was younger still, brilliant and impatient, certain in the way only the young can afford to be certain. And Franklin, 81 years old, gout-ridden, kidney stones so painful that on bad days he had to be carried to the State House in a sedan chair borne by 4 prisoners from the Walnut Street jail, sat near the front of the room and, for long stretches, said almost nothing at all. It was not weakness. Those who watched him closely understood it was something closer to strategy, the same patience that had once outlasted French ministers and English lords now turned toward his own countrymen. He had learned, across 60 years of public life, that the surest way to lose an argument is to need to win it, and the surest way to move a room is to let it believe it has moved itself. So he listened. He listened to Virginia's plan and New Jersey's plan, listened to the small states fear annihilation by the large ones, and the large states resent any arrangement that gave Delaware the same voice as Pennsylvania. Listened to weeks of argument that grew sharper through the unbearable heat of a Philadelphia summer with the windows nailed shut against eavesdroppers, the room thick with the smell of sweat and ink and tobacco, men in wool coats arguing about the shape of forever while flies droned against the glass. When he did speak, it was rarely about the mechanics being debated, the structure of a legislature, the method of choosing an executive, and far more often about the spirit in which men ought to debate them at all. There is a moment, late in the convention, almost lost in the official record, when the delegates had reached one of those impasses that felt for days like it might end the whole enterprise. The question of how the states would be represented, the large states insisting on population, the small states insisting on equality, neither side willing to be the one that yielded first. Franklin, too infirm by then to stand and read his own remarks, had them read aloud by a fellow Pennsylvanian, and in them he said something that those present would remember for the rest of their lives, something that did not argue for a particular formula so much as for the entire posture a person ought to bring into a room full of people they disagree with. He observed that he had lived a long time, and that the longer he lived, the more he found reason to doubt his own infallible judgment of other men's opinions on important subjects, having more than once in his life been obliged, by better information or fuller consideration, to change opinions even on important subjects which he once thought right but found otherwise. It was, on its surface, a small confession. It was, underneath, an entire philosophy of government, offered by a man old enough to have made every mistake a public life affords, and humble enough, even at 81, to say so out loud in a room full of younger men still convinced of their own certainty. He proposed, soon after, the compromise that would save the convention from collapse: equal representation in one chamber, proportional in the other. Though it is worth saying plainly that the idea was not entirely his own. He had a gift, sharpened over decades of negotiation, for taking an idea half-formed in someone else's mouth and returning it improved, attributed quietly, persuasively, to no one and everyone at once. What mattered was not authorship. What mattered was that he understood, in his bones, something Madison understood in his intellect and Hamilton refused to understand at all. That this document would not be perfect, could not be perfect, and that the men in this room insisting on perfection would, if left unchecked, ensure there was no document at all. It is here, in this room, that his contrast with John Adams becomes most vivid. Though Adams himself was an ocean away that summer, serving as minister to Britain, and so the two old colleagues conducted their disagreement at a remove, in letters and in the accounts of mutual friends, the way two men sometimes argue best, not face to face, where pride intervenes, but through the slower medium of ink, where a person has time to mean exactly what he says. Adams thought Franklin lazy, vain, indecisive, a man more interested in being admired than in doing the difficult, unglamorous work of governing. Franklin thought Adams, and said so, in one of the most quoted lines he ever wrote. Always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. The two of them had served together in France, in lodgings so close that Adams once complained of being kept awake by Franklin's late hours and later guests, by his refusal to rise early, by what Adams saw as an almost scandalous comfort with idleness in a man supposedly representing a struggling republic. What Adams could not abide, and never fully forgave, was that Franklin's apparent idleness so often produced exactly what was needed, while Adams's relentless industry so often produced friction, offense, doors closed where Franklin would have found them quietly opened. It was a contrast in temperament that ran far deeper than manners. Adams believed in argument as the engine of truth, believed that a man who did not contend loudly for what was right was failing some essential duty of conscience. Franklin had come, by old age, to believe something nearly opposite. That conviction loudly delivered most often produced not agreement but resistance, that men rarely changed their minds because they had been defeated in conversation, and far more often changed them because they had been allowed to arrive at the new opinion as though it had been their own thought all along. Where Adams wanted to be right and be known to be right, Franklin wanted, simply, for the right thing to happen, and cared remarkably little who received the credit for it. It made him, to some, infuriatingly hard to pin down, a man whose true positions had to be inferred from the slow accumulation of his influence rather than read off any single fiery speech. It also made him, by the late summer of 1787, one of the only people in that sweltering room capable of holding together delegates who, by every account, came astonishingly close, more than once, to walking out entirely. When the convention finally finished its work in September, and the delegates filed up one by one to sign the document that would become the Constitution, Franklin, too frail now to stand easily for long, was helped to his feet, and as he watched Washington's chair at the front of the room, a chair carved with a sun on its high back, half risen, half setting, its rays unclear in their direction, he is said to have remarked to those nearest him that he had, during the long weeks of the convention, often looked at that very image without being able to tell whether it was a rising sun or a setting one. But now, at the end, having watched what these men had managed to build out of disagreement and fatigue and genuine fear of failure, he believed, he said, that it was a rising sun after all. It is a small image, almost a throwaway remark, and yet it has outlived nearly every formal speech given in that room, because it captured something true about the man who said it, a willingness, even after a lifetime of disappointments, to choose hope as a conclusion rather than accept despair as a foregone one. He went home from the State House that September evening the way he went home from most places now, slowly, leaning on a cane, sometimes carried, his body having become, over the years, a kind of inventory of complaints he had learned to discuss with the same dry humor he applied to everything else. The gout had been with him for decades, flaring in his feet and knees until walking became an exercise in negotiation with his own joints. The kidney stone was newer and crueler, a low grinding pain that made the jolt of a carriage almost unbearable, so that for the convention itself he had been carried the few blocks from his house in a sedan chair, an indignity he bore, by every account, with more amusement than self-pity. He joked about it in letters. He told friends that the stone and the gout seemed to have reached an understanding between them, taking turns tormenting him so that he was never without company. Underneath the joke, though, those closest to him could see what it cost him. He slept poorly. He could not read for long without his eyes tiring. The hand that had once filled volumes of correspondence in a single sitting now ached after a page. And yet the mind inside that failing body had not slowed in any way his friends could detect, and in some ways seemed to have only sharpened, the way a fire sometimes burns more cleanly once the green wood has been used up. He kept a small mirror angled outside his study window so that, without rising, he could watch the comings and goings of Market Street, and he treated even this small mechanical comfort as an occasion for observation, noting in letters how much could be learned about a city's character simply by watching, unseen, who passed beneath a window at which hour and why. He had spent his whole life this way, turning ordinary inconvenience into experiment, and old age did not change the habit. When his eyesight began to fail him for reading at normal distance while remaining sharp enough for distant objects, he did not simply accept the inconvenience of switching between two pairs of spectacles. He had a craftsman cut the lenses of each pair in half and combine them in a single frame, the distance lens above, the reading lens below, so that wherever his eyes happened to fall they found the correct correction waiting. He called them, with characteristic understatement, double spectacles. The world would later call them bifocals, and would go on using his solution for a problem he had solved, essentially, out of mild personal irritation and an unwillingness to let a flaw in the design of glasses go unexamined. This was the thread that had run beneath every other version of him. Printer, diplomat, statesman, and it never thinned, not even now. He corresponded about the migratory patterns of fish, about the cause of the common cold, which he suspected, correctly and against the prevailing wisdom of his day, had less to do with chilled air than with close contact among people indoors. He wrote about the heating efficiency of stoves, having designed one himself decades earlier that still bore his name and warmed homes more efficiently than the open hearths it replaced. He took an interest, near the very end of his life, in a French physician's claims about a controversial new treatment involving magnetism, and rather than dismiss or endorse it on reputation alone, he helped organize one of the first formal scientific investigations of its kind, a commission that tested the claims under controlled conditions and found them wanting. An old man, dying by inches, still insisting that even popular and fashionable belief ought to answer to evidence. Curiosity, in him, had never been a phase of youth. It was closer to a discipline, maintained the way some men maintain faith, through habit and through will, long after the body that housed it had begun, visibly, to fail. It was this same capacity, to keep examining, to keep revising what he believed he knew, that carried him, in these final years, toward a position that would have startled the younger version of himself. He had owned slaves once, had bought and sold them in the pages of his own newspaper decades earlier without any apparent unease, had treated the institution for much of his life with the same unreflective acceptance most of his Philadelphia contemporaries brought to it. But something had shifted in him gradually across the decades, the way large things shift in a person, not in a single dramatic conversion, but through a slow accumulation of encounters and arguments he could not quite set aside. He had visited a school for black children in London years earlier and come away unsettled by how easily his own assumptions about inherent capacity had been disproven by what he plainly saw in that classroom. He had watched, during his years abroad, the arguments of French and English abolitionists, had corresponded with men devoted entirely to the cause, had let their reasoning work on him slowly, the way water works on stone. By the time he returned from France for the last time, he had become president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, an organization he lent not just his name to, but his diminishing strength, drafting petitions, writing essays, putting before the very Congress that had just finished compromising its way around the issue in the new Constitution a direct, formal request that it move toward ending the slave trade and the institution itself. It went nowhere. The men who had so recently learned to compromise with each other on representation and taxation were not yet ready to extend that same flexibility to the question of who counted, fully, as a person, and Franklin's petition was tabled, debated briefly, and set aside. He did not live to see the issue resolved. would not have imagined how long the resolution would take, or what it would ultimately cost the country to arrive at it. But in one of the last things he wrote for public consumption, a satire published under a pseudonym, mocking, with the same biting irony he had perfected 60 years earlier as a young printer, the arguments slaveholders used to defend their position by mirroring them precisely in the mouth of a fictional Algerian pirate defending the enslavement of Christians. He made unmistakably clear where he had finally, after a long life of accommodation, decided he stood. It was, in its way, the last great act of a mind that had never stopped being willing to be wrong, and then, having recognized it, to say so loudly enough for the historical record to hear. There was a private side to these years, too, quieter, less often told, that ran beneath the public business of constitutions and petitions like a second current. He had been, for most of his adult life, a man more often absent from his family than present in it, his years in London and then Paris stretching across decades during which his wife Deborah, unwilling to cross the ocean, had managed their household and his affairs alone. Writing him letters he sometimes answered slowly, sometimes barely at all. She had died while he was still in London, before the war had even properly begun, and he had not been there. It was a fact he did not often discuss, but those who knew him well understood it sat somewhere in him unresolved, a debt that could no longer be paid. He had a son, William, his only child to survive infancy from that marriage, who had risen to become the royal governor of New Jersey and who had remained loyal to the crown even as his father became one of the new nation's chief architects, a divide that the war turned, finally and permanently, into estrangement. They exchanged a handful of letters in these last years, stiff, wounded things, full of old grievance dressed as legal and financial discussion. Two men who had once been close now circling each other across an unbridgeable difference neither could fully name aloud. Franklin, in his will, left William little beyond some land and a brief, cutting line acknowledging the part he had played against him, proof that even a man famous for diplomacy could not always find a way to forgive the people closest to him. But there was warmth in these years too, not only old wounds. His daughter Sally had moved with her family into the Market Street house, and the sound of grandchildren filled rooms that had been, for so long, occupied only by his correspondence and his solitude. He doted on them in the particular way old men sometimes do, finding in their noise and their unguarded questions a relief from the careful, weighted conversation of statesmen. He had, throughout his life, formed close, affectionate friendships with women, in London, in Paris, relationships that scandalized some observers and that he never bothered much to explain or defend, correspondences full of flirtation and genuine tenderness that seem, from this distance, to have given him something his marriage, strained by decades of separation, had not always supplied, a sense of being delighted in, attended to, found amusing. In his final years, some of those friendships continued by letter across the ocean, threads of warmth reaching him even as his body confined him more and more to a single house, a single garden, a single chair by a window with its angled mirror. He kept working almost to the end. He served as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society until shortly before his death. He continued his correspondence, dictating when his hand could no longer manage the pen, his mind apparently undimmed even as his body became, in his own words, a poor lodging for it. The kidney stone pain grew severe enough in his final weeks that he required opium simply to rest, and the periods of clarity it allowed him grew shorter. He developed a lung infection in the spring of 1790 that settled into his chest and would not lift. His grandson, who had become something like a secretary and companion to him in these last years, was there in the room when his daughter, trying to ease him, suggested he shift in the bed to a position that might let him breathe more easily. Franklin is said to have answered that a dying man can do nothing easy. They were among the last words attributed to him, and they have the particular ring of truth that his real remarks so often had. Wry, exact, unsentimental, a man observing his own death with the same plain curiosity he had once turned on lightning, on stoves, on the migratory habits of fish. He died on the 17th of April, 1790, at the age of 84. Some 20,000 people are said to have come out for his funeral procession through Philadelphia, a number almost unthinkable for the city at the time. Clergy of every faith walking together behind the coffin, an honor he had specifically hoped for and which suggested, even in the arrangement of his own burial, the same instinct toward unity over division that had carried him through the convention 3 years before. In France, where he had spent those crucial years bending an empire's resources toward a fledgling republic's survival, the National Assembly, in the early throes of its own revolution, declared 3 days of mourning for a foreigner, an honor almost without precedent, a recognition that the old man in the fur cap who had charmed their court had also, in some lasting way, helped teach them something about the possibility of remaking a government from first principles. It is tempting, looking back across the whole arc of his life, to reach for the word great and to let the achievements stand in for the man. The lightning kite, the bifocals, the founding of a nation, the treaties, the institutions, the long list any schoolbook can recite. But what made him remarkable, in the end, was something harder to put on a list, a willingness, sustained across 84 years and through every reversal of fortune, to keep revising himself. He was not born wise. He was, by his own account, vain and combative as a young man, quick to anger, quick to satire, capable of real cruelty in print toward people who crossed him. He spent the early decades of his adulthood building, through deliberate and almost relentless self-examination, the patient, generous temperament that the world would later come to associate with his name, as though it had simply always been there. It had not. He made it, the way he made almost everything else in his life, through trial, through failure, through the willingness to look at evidence that contradicted his comfort and change course anyway. About printing, about science, about diplomacy, about slavery, about himself. That, perhaps, is the quieter inheritance beneath all the famous ones. Not the discoveries, not the treaties, not even the Constitution he helped hold together through one improbable summer, but the demonstration, lived out across a long and difficult span of years, that a person is not a fixed thing arriving fully formed into the world, but something built slowly, mistake by mistake, correction by correction, until what remains at the end is not perfection. He would have been the first to scoff at the word, but something close to it in the ways that matter. A mind still curious on its last clear days, a conscience still capable of growth even in its final chapter, and a life that, looked at whole, reads less like a monument and more like an argument, gently and patiently made, that it is never too late to keep becoming someone better than you were. The funeral itself deserves a slower telling than the bare fact of the crowd that gathered for it, because there was something in the particular shape of that procession that captured, almost too perfectly, the strange position he had occupied in life. Ministers of every denomination in the city walked together that day. Anglican and Quaker, Presbyterian and Catholic, Jewish and Baptist clergy shoulder to shoulder behind the coffin, an arrangement Franklin himself had specifically requested decades earlier, in a will he had revised more than once as his thinking continued to change. He had belonged fully to none of these faiths and had quietly supported all of them, having donated, over the years, to the building funds of churches and synagogues across the city regardless of denomination, on the theory, which he stated plainly more than once, that he would rather see a roof go up over any group sincerely seeking truth than argue them into agreement with his own private uncertainties first. It was a small thing, that funeral arrangement, but it told the truth about him more honestly than any eulogy delivered that week. He had spent a long life building bridges between people who distrusted one another, and he had arranged, even in death, for one last demonstration of how it could be done. The newspapers of the following weeks were full of tributes, many of them overwrought in the way obituaries for great men tend to be, full of marble language about genius and providence that would likely have made him wince, given how often in life he had punctured exactly that kind of inflated rhetoric with a well-placed joke. But buried among the formal eulogies were smaller, stranger details that perhaps tell more. Workmen at the Philadelphia printing houses, men who had never met him, are recorded to have closed their shops for the day out of respect for a man they considered, in some sense, the founding figure of their own trade in America. Children who had grown up reading his almanac, the one he had filled decades earlier with proverbs about thrift and industry under the invented name of Poor Richard, recited those same sayings to each other in the streets the week he died, not as scripture, but as something closer to family inheritance, phrases so thoroughly absorbed into the common language of the country that many who used them no longer remembered, or had perhaps never known, exactly where they had come from. That, in its way, is its own kind of immortality, quieter than statues, more durable than most of them. To have your words survive so completely inside a culture's habits of speech that they stop being quotations and simply become what people say. It is worth sitting, for a moment, with what he actually left behind, beyond the document that bears his fingerprints if not quite his single authorship. He left a library and a set of instruments to a young nation hungry for institutions of learning, having founded, decades earlier, the academy that would grow into a university, the library company that lent books to ordinary tradesmen who could never otherwise have afforded them, the hospital that treated Philadelphia's sick regardless of their ability to pay, the fire company, the militia, the postal service that would, in time, knit a sprawling and fractious country into something capable of communicating with itself. He had built almost none of these things to glorify his own name. Many of them he founded anonymously, working through clubs and committees, and proposals floated under other men's signatures, because he had learned early, as a young printer trying to win over a city that did not yet trust him, that an idea travels further and meets less resistance when it does not appear to serve its proposer's vanity. It is a strange thing to notice, looking back across the full sweep of his life, how often the project's history now credits entirely to him were, in his own telling, the work of unnamed committees he had merely helped assemble. He seemed to have understood, long before anyone wrote it down as a theory of leadership, that influence wielded invisibly outlasts influence claimed loudly, and that the truest mark of having changed something is that people forget, eventually, that it needed changing at all. There is a final irony worth lingering on, the kind he himself would likely have appreciated with a dry, private amusement. The man who had spent his last years arguing, with diminishing strength and against a Congress unwilling to listen, for the abolition of slavery, had also been, in his youth, a slaveholder himself, and the nation whose founding document he had helped negotiate into existence would carry that same unresolved contradiction forward for another 70 years, through a war far bloodier than the one he had helped win, before it was forced, at unimaginable cost, to answer the question he had tried and failed to put before it in 1790. He did not solve that problem. He did not pretend, in his final petition to Congress, that the Constitution he had helped shape was finished or sufficient on the question. He asked the men who had just written it to go further than they were willing to go, and they declined. And he was not naive enough, by 84, to be surprised by that refusal even as he insisted on making it anyway. Perhaps that, too, is part of what made him who he was. Not the conceit that he had gotten everything right, but the persistence to keep pushing on the things he had gotten wrong, even when the pushing produced no visible result within his own lifetime, even when he must have suspected he would not live to see the argument won. What remains, finally, when the statesman's achievements and the scientist's discoveries and the diplomat's treaties are all accounted for, is something closer to a temperament than a resume, a particular way of moving through a difficult world that he seems to have built deliberately, plank by plank, over the whole span of his life, the way a younger version of himself might have built a stove or a printing press, through patient trial and willing correction. He believed, in a way that ran almost contrary to the certainties of his age, that humility was not weakness but a kind of practical wisdom, that the willingness to say I was wrong was not a defeat but a tool, the same way a hinge is not a flaw in a door but the very thing that allows it to open. He carried that belief into a stifling room in the summer of 1787 and used it to help hold together a fragile agreement that the loudest, most certain men in that room might, left to themselves, have shattered through sheer unwillingness to yield an inch. He carried it, too, into his final years, using it to overturn even his own earlier complicity in slavery, proof that the same humility he asked of quarreling statesmen he was willing, in the end, to turn on himself. Centuries on, what people tend to remember first is the kite, the lightning, the face on the currency, the wig and spectacles of a man who seems, in popular memory, to have been born already old and already wise. But the truer story, the one worth carrying away from a long night spent in his company, is of a man who was not born that way at all, who arrived in Philadelphia at 17 with almost nothing, who made every kind of mistake a young and ambitious person can make, who quarreled, who erred, who held beliefs in his 30s he would be ashamed of by his 70s, and who simply, stubbornly, across 60 years of public life, kept revising the draft. He never seems to have believed himself finished. Even at 84, breathless in a sick room, dictating his last letters through pain that opium could only partly dull, his mind was still moving, still curious, still willing to be persuaded by a better argument than the one it currently held. That, perhaps, is the quiet lesson tucked beneath all the louder ones history has chosen to remember him for. That a life well lived is not the achievement of a fixed and final wisdom, but the lifelong, unfinished practice of remaining open to becoming wiser still, and that the rising sun he once wondered about on the back of a wooden chair was, in the end, not a question about the nation he had helped to build, but a question he had been quietly answering, about himself, the entire time. There is one more image worth leaving the listener with, small and almost domestic, the kind of detail that outlasts grander ones precisely because it asks for nothing. In his final years, on the clear evenings when the pain allowed him to sit up a while longer, he would have his chair turned toward that angled mirror by the window, watching, without needing to move, the ordinary traffic of Market Street below, a cart passing, a neighbor's lamp being lit, children running somewhere they had been told not to run. He had spent a lifetime looking outward at empires and at lightning, at the vast mechanisms of nations and skies, and here, at the very end, his attention had folded back down to the smallest possible scale, content simply to watch the world go on without him needing to direct it. It is, perhaps, the truest measure of a man who had spent 84 years learning, again and again, when to act and when simply to observe, when to speak and when the wiser course was silence. The light through that window would have moved slowly across the room in those last evenings, the way it does in any ordinary house, indifferent to history, indifferent to greatness, marking nothing more than the quiet, unremarkable passage of another day completed. And somewhere in that plain, fading light, the long unfinished draft of his life came, at last, to its final and unforced rest.